further ado, let us bring to the stage Roger Stone, author of the book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ. When you hear Mr. Stone speak about who this man was, picking his dogs up by the ears is just the beginning. Roger, come most presently upon your hour.
This morning was a somewhat historic morning here in Dallas. At 8 o'clock this morning, I was on local Fox 4, and for the first time in the history of Dallas, the truth of the John F. Kennedy assassination was discussed, and the main murderer, the linchpin of the plan to murder John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was identified: Lyndon Baines Johnson. Folks, I don't think Lyndon Johnson killed John Kennedy. I know Lyndon Johnson killed John Kennedy. I first want to talk a little bit about my authority to make such a case. I worked for 3 American presidents, had regular access to 3 American presidents. I spent 40 years in the corroded rectum of the two-party system. I used to be a rabid Republican, but today I have sadly concluded that both parties have morphed into one party. It is the big spying party, the big spending party, the big taxing party, and the big cover-up party. It's sad because I come from the Republican Party of Barry Goldwater, a party that was supposed to be based in the concept of liberty and personal freedom. But very sadly, both parties have become one. And both parties have worked together to continue to cover up the truth about what really transpired on November 22nd, 1963. I think the important thing to understand is that one wants to accept that Lyndon Johnson was the linchpin of a plot to kill John Kennedy. One does not need to disbelieve the full involvement of the Central Intelligence Agency, the full involvement of organized crime, the full involvement of big Texas oil. Indeed, the supposition that Johnson was the linchpin of a plot does not mean that those other entities are innocent. Indeed, I would make the case to you that LBJ is their common thread. Lyndon Johnson controls the aerospace subcommittee where the CIA budgets are hidden throughout the 50s. He is the paymaster for the Central Intelligence Agency. Lyndon Johnson is taking massive bribes from Carlos Marcello and the Dallas mob to cover up illegal gambling in San Antonio and Houston and Dallas and Austin. In fact, the man who passes those bribes to Lyndon Johnson, Jack Halfin, is later pardoned by President Lyndon Johnson. And of course, it is a matter of public record that Lyndon Johnson is the chief water carrier for Big Texas Oil in their efforts to protect the oil depletion allowance, the sweetheart tax deal that saves men like H.L. Hunt and D.H. Byrd hundreds of millions of dollars in federal taxes. Yesterday morning, for about an hour, I debated Professor John McAdams on the radio. This guy makes it up as he goes along. I mean, this is truly pathetic. I want to first acknowledge the terrific talk by Richard Bartholomew. He nailed it. He nailed it. Because I believe that Malcolm Mac Wallace, a convicted murderer, a man who murdered a gentleman named John Kinzer, who was romantically involved with Lyndon Johnson's party girl, sometimes prostitute sister, and who was attempting to blackmail Senator Johnson, was convicted of murder. When he drove from Virginia, where he had a federal patronage job arranged for by Senator Lyndon Johnson, to Austin. He murdered Kinzer in broad daylight in front of witnesses, and when he was apprehended, he said, "You can't arrest me. I have to get back to Washington. I work for Senator Johnson." His lawyer at trial for murder was John Cofer, Lyndon Johnson's personal attorney, And the two gentlemen providing for his bail, that would be H.L. Hunt and D.H., better known as Dry Hole Bird. Mr. Bird should be familiar to us. He owned the Texas School Book Depository building. And in fact, immediately after Mr. Wallace was convicted of first-degree murder, he received a suspended sentence. The first and only time in the history of Texas jurisprudence that a man was convicted of first-degree murder and then given a walk. Why? The awesome political power of Lyndon Baines Johnson. Now, to believe that Lyndon Johnson had the capacity to kill John Kennedy, and we'll speak about motive, means, and opportunity in a minute, one has to understand the personality, the character of Johnson. It is not the picture painted for us by the Lyndon Baines Johnson Library in Austin. Lyndon Johnson was not a warm, cuddly advocate of civil rights. He was a morally bankrupt, epically corrupt, crude, sadistic, vicious, greedy, power-hungry, duplicitous, mentally unbalanced, deranged psychopath. This is a man who, as a boy, tied a stick of dynamite to a dog and blew him up in the town square for his own amusement. This is a man who, as a teenager, beat a mule to death with an axe handle for his own amusement. This is a man who I believe, and I detail this in my book, is responsible for at least 17 murders. Murders to cover up corruption. Murders to cover up vote stealing. Murders to cover up election fraud. Lyndon Johnson could order a murder the way you and I would order a ham sandwich. This is a man who fathered at least 3 illegitimate children while either vice president or president. There are 2 of them at least still living. I name them in my book. Don't wait around for the libel suit because it's not coming. A simple DNA test would prove the point. And if Lyndon Johnson's illegitimate son, who lives in Washington, walks into the courtroom, the case will be closed. He's a dead ringer for his daddy. No, there's no question about Lyndon Johnson's capability. Now let's speak to his motive. And let's speak to the motives of others involved in this plot. Lyndon Johnson's motive, of those who are at the table that day, is the most immediate. He is not just trying to prevent being dropped from the 1964 Democratic ticket by JFK. He is trying to avoid the federal penitentiary. He is trying to avoid prosecution for epic corruption. Robert Caro wrote a 3-volume biography of Lyndon Johnson. These are terrific books. They're very colorful. They're very descriptive. But how did Mr. Caro completely omit the name of Billy Sol Estes? The Billy Sol Estes scandal was one of the biggest scandals of the 60s. But it's absent from Mr. Caro's book. Mr. Caro sins by omission. But that's okay. Maybe Robert Caro and his wife can get invited to the right cocktail parties on the Upper East Side of New York. Maybe his books will be reviewed in the New York Times and the Washington Post. I hope he can live with himself. No, in fact, Lyndon Johnson knew that there were at least 9 full-time investigative reporters on the ground in Dallas working on a December 1st cover story for Life magazine into the finances of Lyndon Johnson. And they learned that Johnson came to public office dirt poor, and he would leave a multimillionaire. Even more troubling for Lyndon Johnson was a column scheduled to run on November 24th, 1963 by Drew Pearson. Drew Pearson was the most influential and powerful syndicated columnist of his day. This column would have run on the front page of 700 newspapers across the country, and it detailed Lyndon Johnson taking a $100,000 bribe to deliver a defense contract for General Dynamics in Fort Worth. This was a story, as were the life stories, the Time life stories, planted by Robert Kennedy. This was the beginning of the end for LBJ. He was looking at prison, public humiliation. So his motive is clear, and his motive is immediate. The Central Intelligence Agency, their motives are equally clear but different. Yes, they were upset about the Bay of Pigs. There's no question that they blamed John Kennedy for the lack of air support, which they believe turned the Bay of Pigs invasion into a fiasco. Kennedy insisted he never agreed to air support. The Central Intelligence Agency tries to talk him into it at the last minute as a way to, quote unquote, save the mission. But I believe that the Central Intelligence Agency and the Joint Chiefs and Army Intelligence are more upset about the Cuban Missile Crisis, because the story we've been told that John Kennedy faced down the Russians and they blinked and removed their missiles is simply not true. We removed our missiles from Turkey and Italy, and what a Boston-style backroom political deal with Nikita Khrushchev. But the American people were not told that truth for 40 years. That was classified for 40 years. The Central Intelligence Agency knew in real time. The Joint Chiefs knew in real time. So their motive is clear. Organized crime? Well, Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy took a $1 million contribution from the Chicago mob for John Kennedy's presidential campaign. The mob agreed to deliver votes or intimidate voters, first in the early primaries, particularly West Virginia, but later in the city of Chicago. And in return, Ambassador Kennedy promised that the Eisenhower administration efforts to deport Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante, two of the most influential gangsters of their day, would be dropped. Well, I think most of you know the story. Ambassador Kennedy was incapacitated with a stroke. Robert Kennedy became Attorney General, and he went after Marcello and Trafficante with an axe. He actually illegally kidnapped and deported Marcello, dropped him in Guatemala wearing nothing but his Gucci shoes and his Shantung silk suit without a dime. David Ferry, I believe, flew him back to the United States. So the motive of the mob is clear, and Lyndon Johnson's unique relationship with the mob is clear. And then, of course, there's Big Texas Oil. Their motive is simply money. John Kennedy has publicly announced his intention to do away with the oil depletion allowance. That alone is reason enough for them to seek the removal of JFK. Now, I think, like any good criminal case, the case against Lyndon Johnson has to be based in motive, means, and opportunity. We've addressed the motive. Now let's talk about the means. Well, in 1963, murder is a state crime, not a federal crime. Later, it is made a federal crime to kill a federal officer. The president would qualify as a federal officer, but in 1963, the investigation of John Kennedy's murder will be handled by the Dallas Police Department and the Dallas District Attorney. Indeed, the Dallas District Attorney, within an hour of Kennedy's killing, holds a press conference and says, there was a conspiracy, we will get to the bottom of it, and those responsible will be apprehended. Then he gets a call from an aide to Lyndon Johnson. Now he holds another press conference. There was no conspiracy, there was one individual, and we will bring that individual to justice. I'm paraphrasing. The Dallas police, you can see the pictures. Dallas Police Chief Jerry Curry doesn't leave Lyndon Johnson's side for the entire 72 hours after the assassination. As Robert Kennedy would say to the Russians in a post-assassination message, Dallas was the perfect place for the crime. Lyndon Johnson is able to control the investigation. Of course, ultimately, control of the investigation would be handed from the Dallas Police Department and the Dallas County District Attorney to the FBI, where Lyndon Johnson's next-door neighbor and longtime friend and patron, J. Edgar Hoover, well, Hoover took it from there, shall we say. Hoover's motive, very simple. He's moving up on federal mandatory retirement age. He knows that Robert and John Kennedy have every intention of putting him out to pasture in 1964. So his motive, I think, is clear. Johnson and Hoover are so close that when Congressman Lyndon Johnson steals his Senate seat in 1948, there are two victory parties held for the congressman, or I should say the senator-elect, one in Austin, one in Dallas. And J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, flies in for the Austin party for a lowly congressman about to go to the Senate. Now, I'm a veteran of 8 national presidential campaigns. I understand that politics is not beanbag, but one must simply examine the 1948 Senate election to understand the character of Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson lost that election until 221 new votes, additional votes, are found in Jim Wells County. And the amazing thing about these voters is they all had the same handwriting, they voted in alphabetical order, and they all voted after the polls were closed. When I visited Austin several weeks ago, by the way, I'm very popular in Austin, as you might expect, I was actually allowed to hold and be photographed with the famous Box 13, the voting box in which these fraudulent votes were cast. Now, ultimately, that case would go all the way to the Supreme Court. Lyndon Johnson would wire his stolen election and would take the Senate seat that had eluded him only 2 years previous. It speaks again to the character of Lyndon Johnson. This has been a very interesting experience for me because last year I published my book for the first time in hardcover on the 50th anniversary of John Kennedy's murder. As you might imagine, my book was not reviewed in the New York Times. It was not reviewed in the Washington Post. I was not invited to CNN. Well, that's actually not true. I was invited to CNN, and then when they learned what I was there to talk about, they canceled. Fortunately, I did appear a couple times on Fox, although it is interesting to note that Tom Johnson, the chairman emeritus of CNN, a former aide to President Lyndon Johnson, actually called a very high official at Fox News and tried to talk them into canceling that segment. Folks, the cover-up continues, the whitewash continues, but the good news is that unlike 1963, when there were only 3 television networks, and therefore if it wasn't shown on CBS or ABC or NBC, it didn't happen. We had a handful of national newspapers. If the story wasn't in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Chicago Tribune or the LA Times, it simply didn't happen. The invention of talk radio, the invention of the internet, the invention of cable TV is the single best thing that ever happened in the search for truth in regards to the Kennedy murder. Consequently, without the New York Times and CBS and the others, my book became a national bestseller. The other thing I learned was that when you write a book on a controversial subject like this, you will immediately become inundated with new information that is passed to you over the transom, as it will. Just average citizens, but people who know things, people who have documents, people whose fathers and grandfathers and relatives told them stories. And some of these stories are true, and some of them are apocryphal. And it is the job of the researcher to dig in and try to confirm what he has heard. I have expanded my book now with 2 additional chapters and an afterword, including a lot of this new material. So to give you an example, I know that when Robert Kennedy lay mortally wounded in a Los Angeles hospital, that his press secretary, Pierre Salinger, who I knew, and his brother-in-law, Stephen Smith, called Vice President Hubert Humphrey and said, "Mr. Vice President, there's a brain surgeon in Boston who we believe could save Bobby's life. will you dispatch a military plane to bring him immediately to Los Angeles? And Humphrey said, I'll do it. And Vice President Humphrey contacted the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and he ordered that plane dispatched to Boston immediately to bring this renowned surgeon to Los Angeles. 20 minutes later, President Lyndon Johnson called Vice President Humphrey and chewed his ass. I've canceled that plane, he said. You had no authority to send it. This is the same Lyndon Johnson who saw a Secret Service agent wearing a PT-109 tie clip, pulled it off him and threw it in the trash. I visited the LBJ Ranch, which is a national park, 2 weeks ago when I was in Austin. There's a lot of pictures of dignitaries on the wall. Lyndon Johnson and the Shah of Iran, Lyndon Johnson and the King of Monaco, Lyndon Johnson and the the Prime Minister of Canada, Lyndon Johnson and a dozen cabinet members and U.S. senators. Let me tell you who there are no photographs of. John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Some of you may have been told the myth that John Kennedy selected Lyndon Johnson for vice president. That's a lie, too. He was blackmailed into choosing Lyndon Johnson. In fact, if one believes the memoirs of Clark Clifford, a Johnson intimate, John Kennedy had already selected Senator Stuart Symington of Missouri, one of the more boring individuals on the face of the earth, to be his vice president. In fact, Symington was already working on his acceptance speech. And then Lyndon Johnson and Speaker Sam Rayburn of Texas appear in John Kennedy's hotel suite late at night. It is very notable that Robert Kennedy is not present. And they show Senator Kennedy a dossier on his sex life, provided by Lyndon Johnson's close friend, J. Edgar Hoover. And essentially, Johnson says to Jack Kennedy, you need me, you need Texas, and if you don't take me, I'll simply give this file to Dick Nixon. This, by the way, is the second step of the enmity between Robert Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. The first step in that long struggle of mutual hatred happens when someone, Lyndon Johnson, breaks into John Kennedy's doctor's office in New York City and obtains proof that John Kennedy is being treated for Addison's disease. The historian Robert Dallek blames that on Richard Nixon, without an iota of proof. It wasn't Nixon. How do we know? Because John Connally announces in a press conference at the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles that Jack Kennedy's being treated for Addison's disease. This begins the long-standing feud between Robert Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. Speaks again to the character and tactics of LBJ. So as I say, Johnson was just not fearing the end of the road politically. He was fearing total and complete annihilation at the hands of Robert Kennedy. Now, I am not by any means the first author who has put forward the thesis or the documentation that LBJ killed JFK. In fact, I owe an enormous amount to authors before me. First and foremost, perhaps, Barr McClellan, who worked for the Johnson family as an attorney, and whose book is must-reading. Phil Nelson, who is with us today, who you will hear from, whose first book, LBJ, the mastermind of the JFK assassination, is literally a masterpiece, and whose new book, LBJ, the Colossus, available here, is a must-read. James Tague, who I had the great fortune to become a friend of shortly before his death, and who I appeared with in Dallas last November. His book helps connect the dots. This is not some outlandish theory History is a set of lies agreed upon. Real history is truth. Truth has no ideology. Now, Richard Nixon was in Dallas 51 years ago yesterday. In fact, he would have left Dallas 51 years ago this morning. And it is interesting to me that while he was here, he held a press conference at his hotel in which he said, JFK will drop LBJ from the ticket because of the swirling scandals around him. Johnson has become a liability. Somehow this has been airbrushed from history. I also believe that Nixon met privately with Johnson at his hotel, and Johnson set Nixon on a diversionary course. He told Nixon he was deeply concerned about the climate of hate in Dallas, and he asked Nixon to contact Congressman Bruce Alger. He's one of yours, Dick. This guy's got a big mouth. You need to quiet him down. He keeps talking about the president being guilty of treason. This is a setup, in my opinion. It's very important, I think, to understand that in 1963, the visiting Richard Nixon is finished. He's washed up. He has been. He has no power in Washington. He's practicing law on Wall Street and not very happy about it. Sure, he is still nurturing dreams of being president, but in 1962, after the 1960 election, I believe, was stolen from him by Lyndon Johnson more than anyone else, he actually goes to his home state of California and runs a disastrous campaign for governor. So now he is a two-time loser. And in a fit of pique, in a fit of anger, he really kind of ends his political career by holding a press conference and saying, I'm finished with politics. Gentlemen, he says, think how much you'll be missing. You won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore. Only 6 years later, he has his hand on the Bible and he is being sworn in as President of the United States. And therefore, as Nixon, who I was on intimate terms with and who I worked for, flies that morning from Dallas to New York, he learns in transit that Kennedy has been shot. He learns when he gets to his apartment house on Park Avenue, which, by the way, is the same apartment house where he lived as a neighbor of Nelson Rockefeller, go figure, that Kennedy is dead. He goes immediately to his apartment and he calls Edgar Hoover, who of course he knows from his time in Congress and 8 years as Vice President of the United States, and he says, Edgar, was it one of those right-wing nuts? No, Hoover says, no, Dick, it was a communist. JFK has only been pronounced dead at that point for 7 minutes. And Hoover already knows it's a communist. Now, I believe that Nixon actually believed the cover story for 48 hours. That's until he's watching TV with the rest of America and he sees Jack Ruby blow away Lee Harvey Oswald on national television. And according to his aide, Nick Ruey, he jumps bolt upright from his chair, points to the screen and says, I know that man. Why? Well, because House records show us that in 1946, Congressman Richard Nixon put Jack Rubenstein of Chicago on the U.S. House payroll as an informant for the House Un-American Activities Committee. And he did this as a courtesy for Congressman Lyndon Baines Johnson. Now, I have worked both in the U.S. Senate and in the House of Representatives as an assistant to Senator Bob Dole, as an assistant to Congressman Robert Steele. And I can tell you this is a very common occurrence, that when one member has excess staff money available, another member will often ask him as a courtesy to put somebody on a part-time basis. This is perhaps why Richard Nixon said to me directly, you know, the difference between Lyndon and I was we both wanted to be president, but I wasn't willing to kill for it. Now, I don't hold by any means that Richard Nixon was an angel, that he was perfect, that he didn't make egregious errors, errors of policy, errors of a criminal nature in Watergate. He was both, in my opinion, very great and very flawed, very brilliant and very obtuse, very confident and very paranoid. But he knew Lyndon Johnson, who referred to, and you see this on YouTube, as an animal. Robert Kennedy referred to Lyndon Johnson as an animal. Two of Johnson's own aides, George Reedy and Bill Moyers, actually asked themselves about Johnson's mental state. They believe he's having a psychiatric breakdown during his presidency. Speaks again to the character of Lyndon Johnson. So, I commend you for being here today. I commend you for your interest in the truth. I commend you for continuing to speak to others, to spread the word, to take the research of so many fine speakers you're going to have here this weekend, and to get more people interested in what really happened on the streets of Dallas in 1963. The most encouraging thing in the 21 city tour that I have done to promulgate my book is the interest of young people. You see, young people have no preconceived notions. They don't know what the Warren Commission was or how flawed it is. They don't know the personalities of John Kennedy, who had the capacity to be one of our greatest presidents. But this is a murder mystery. And because John Kennedy was only president for 2 years and was never allowed to fulfill his term and perhaps serve another, you can project onto John Kennedy anything you want. He was a liberal. He was a conservative. He was an anti-communist. He was going to kill Castro. He was going to normalize relationships with Castro. He was going to win the war in Vietnam. He was going to end the war in Vietnam. We will never know, because an assassin's bullet snuffs out the rest of this story. There is hope because of the internet, because of an entire new generation of people whose minds are not made up, whose minds are still open about the truth of what happened. Now, I believe that the events that begin in the late 1950s with the CIA, mob, plots to kill Fidel Castro, which morph into the Bay of Pigs, which morphs into the Kennedy assassination, which morphs into Watergate, which morphs into the pardon, which morphs into the rise of George Bush, which morphs into the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan, which morphs into the presidency, ultimately, of George W. Bush. These are all interrelated events. There's a thread of history. The strangest thing about these things when you research them is the same exact cast of characters. Why were 4 of the Watergate burglars on the ground in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 1963? How likely is that? And those same 4 men were there at the Bay of Pigs. And those same 4 men were involved in the Castro assassination plots. The same individuals. This is like, these guys are like a bad penny. They just keep turning up. This is not a historical coincidence. And therefore, I think one has to step back and look at the totality of the thread of history. Now, you may hear from a speaker this weekend that the Central Intelligence Agency is solely responsible for the murder of John Kennedy, and that the fingerprint found on the cardboard boxes in the sniper's nest on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository is not the print of Malcolm Wallace. And when that speaker tells you that, you should object, because that's wrong. As the previous speaker said, There's been a definite match on 34 points on that print. I myself have had that print examined by an independent analysis, and they come up with the same conclusion. Malcolm Mac Wallace, who worked for the defense contractor owned by D.H. Byrd, the same man who owned the Texas School Book Depository Building, a man who was convicted of first-degree murder, who then went immediately to work for Byrd at his defense contracting company, which would ultimately be LTV, left an indelible print in the sniper's nest. No fewer than 6 witnesses see a man in the window and tell either the FBI or the Dallas Police Department this. They see a man in the window who matches the physical description, not of Lee Harvey Oswald, but of Malcolm Wallace. Middle-aged, balding, paunchy, wearing glasses. By the way, virtually every one of them identify his spectacles. One of them says horn-rimmed spectacles. One of those witnesses, Richard Carr, just an average citizen, just a good guy, just an average Joe, goes down to Dealey Plaza in the hopes that he might see the President of the United States drive by. He sees a man who meets the description of Wallace fleeing the building. Poor Mr. Carr, he has 4 attempts on his life in the 6 years afterwards. Why would you kill this man unless he saw something very, very important? No, I'm not an absolutist. There are those in the research community who say, oh, no, it was the CIA and all other theories are inoperative. I disagree with that. I think these are interrelated and locking parts. Yes, the Central Intelligence Agency they're there. They're at the table. They're involved in this hit. So is organized crime. So is Big Texas Oil. But ladies and gentlemen, the grand marshal of this parade is Lyndon Baines Johnson. The Latins have a saying, cui bono sequest est fit. He who derives the greatest benefit from the crime is the one who committed it. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take your questions.